By the time I rolled my little blue suitcase up the crushed shell driveway, my name had already been erased. The house looked the same. Same cedar shingles, same porch swing, same plaque that once said Holloway. Except now, it didn't feel like mine. 3 weeks earlier, I'd left for rehab after a mild stroke, just a short recovery. I came back expecting tea, quiet. Maybe my son waiting with open arms. Instead, he stood in the doorway like a security guard, and beside him, his wife, Claire, holding a stack of legal folders like weapons. "Mom," he said, voice too bright, "there's been an update." Then she said the word that turned my stomach cold. Guardianship. In 68 years, I'd been called a lot of things. Mother, widow, teacher, but never incompetent. I wasn't allowed to step inside my own house, so I did the only thing left. I walked back down that driveway, pulled out my phone, and texted the last person I ever expected to need again. I need help. The reply came instantly. "Where are you?" That's when I realized this wasn't about my health. It was about my name and the people who were trying to steal it with paper. The reply arrived before the screen dimmed. "Where are you?" I looked at my son standing in a doorway as if he were security. I looked at the house where I made him pancakes shaped like initials. And then I turned and walked down the crushed shells while the seam of the tide whispered against the rocks beyond the spruce. I checked into a roadside motel because it was close, because it had windows that faced the parking lot and the harbor beyond, and because they took cash without asking questions that would need answers I didn't have. The bedspread was a pattern of green leaves that tried too hard to be cheerful. A boat horn blew once as if to say, "I see you." When the knock came an hour later, it was followed by the familiar tap of knuckles that always made me think of autumn assemblies and the click of a microphone. I opened the door, and there was Noah Grant. He filled the frame with a sort of serious warmth that made parents say yes to him and troublemakers hesitate. The last time I'd seen him, he'd been 25 with a messy notebook and a camera he never put down. He was my former student, the one who wrote editorials that made our school board put phones down and listen. Now he was 33 with a press badge and a national byline and a coat that still had ink on it. "You look exactly like yourself," he said, stepping in, and then he held my elbows with careful hands. "Hi, Principal Holloway." "Margaret," I corrected. "I haven't been your principal for a decade." "You always will be," he said. A lightness touched his mouth and then gone. "Tell me everything." I told him. I told him about my suitcase and the front hall and the way Claire said practical, the way some people say mercy. I told him about a second will and a guardianship petition, and the way Ethan's shoulder filled a doorway. Noah didn't take notes at first. He watched me as if measuring how much more I could give before the words diluted with exhaustion. When he finally opened his notebook, his left hand pressed against the top of the page the way he did as a teenager when he wanted his handwriting to carry the right weight. "Do you trust me?" he asked me when I ran out of words. "Yes," I said. It surprised me a little how certain the answer felt in my mouth, with my life. "Good," he said, "because I brought a sandwich. You're going to eat while I make calls." He stood at the small table beneath a painting of a lighthouse I could name without reading the brass caption. He dialed. "Brooks, it's Noah. You still in Rockport PD, or did you take that job in Portland? Great, I need a favor. Off the record, guardianship petition ex parte on a 68-year-old woman without a physician evaluation. Does that track?" "Uh-huh. Send me the docket when you find it." He ended one call and made another. "Pearson Landry, this is Noah Grant. I'm calling about the Holloway estate file. I'd like to confirm counsel of record and availability." "Yes, I'll hold." He made 3 more calls and then sat down and handed me half the sandwich. My hands trembled. I liked the way he pretended not to see. "Detective Lena Brooks says an ex-parte temporary guardianship here requires at least a clinician's affidavit," he said. "Not just a lawyer's say-so." "Then how—" "Claire," we said together, and Noah added, "Who knows exactly how to thread a needle if you let her?" I chewed. The sandwich tasted better than any food had since the day in the rehab center, when I thought my mouth had gone permanently bland. Alan Pierce will see us at 9 tomorrow morning, Noah said. He's, tense? And the county clerk is emailing me the docket summary for the guardianship case. There was a knock on the motel door again. It wasn't Ethan. The person outside moved with quietness and patience. Noah rose, stood to one side of the door, and then nodded at me. It was a small choreography we'd performed 100 times when he was the newspaper editor and I was the woman who handled angry parents and the occasional uninvited visitor. I opened the door. Detective Brooks had the tired posture of someone who liked her job but didn't like what it sometimes required. "Mrs. Holloway," she said, looking at me and then at Noah. "You two always did make a formidable team." "I retired," I said. "I teach no one. I can't even open my own front door." Brooks came in and pulled a chair from the desk to the end of the bed, so we could sit in a triangle that felt like decent conversation rather than interrogation. "Noah says there's a court petition making you temporarily incompetent," she said. "I'd like to see it." "It's coming," Noah said, glancing at his phone. "Hold on." It buzzed. He opened the email and slid the phone across the table. Brooks read. Her mouth went flat at the edges. "I know Judge Harlan," she said. "He's cautious. He doesn't issue ex-parte guardianships absent clear evidence." She scrolled. "We're missing 2 exhibits. It references a physician's affidavit and a neuropsychological screen." "I never saw a doctor except the rehab team," I said. "And my rehab doctor would never say I was incompetent." I let my voice sharpen like a pencil. "A speech therapist told me to read out loud for 30 minutes a day. That is not incompetence." Brooks gave the phone back to Noah and pressed her fingers to her eyelids briefly, then looked at me. "I'm off duty for another 30 minutes, she said. "If you want me to walk you through this morning as a friend, I can do that. After that, this becomes an investigation with rules." "I like rules," I said. "They're why people don't get pushed out of their own lives." "Good," she said. She looked at Noah. "You'll want to call your guy in Boston." "My guy?" "The cyber guy," Brooks said. "If there's forgery here, it's probably not just pen on paper." "I'll call Patel," Noah said. And the way he said it told me there was a person behind the name who answered his calls in the first ring and could tell the difference between a real voice and a clever imitation. "Mrs. Holloway," Brooks said, turning back to me, "are you willing to let me go with you to see Alan Pierce tomorrow?" "Yes," I said. "Good," she said again, stood and buttoned her jacket. "Get some sleep. Eat again. We'll pick this up where you left your name." When I did sleep that night, it was the thin kind that breaks easily with the sound of truck brakes on Route 1. In dreams, the house swelled and shrank like a lung. In the morning, the motel coffee was exactly as bad as I remembered from every conference I'd ever attended. The sky over the harbor glowed pink before the wind messed it up with gray. Pierce and Landry's office sat in a mansard-roofed building with a view of the boat ramp. The waiting room had carpet that wanted to look like a Persian rug. Alan pierced his way through the door at 3 minutes past 9, with his tie slightly askew, and his hair doing that thing it had done since 1998, where it floated up on one side no matter how firmly he combed it back. He had been our neighbor and our lawyer, and I liked him precisely because he was both, and because he knew which part of that to put first, depending on the minute. "Margaret," he said quietly, and in the way he said my name, I heard 3 things at once: sympathy, caution, and a plea not to make him commit malpractice. Noah and Brooks sat behind me like bookends. Alan guided us into a small conference room where the table had the polished feel of an object that never learned to accept a coffee ring. He closed the door, exhaled through his nose, and spread his hands. "I can't tell you everything," he said, "but I can tell you this. There are 2 wills." "No," I said. "Yes," he said, and his tired face said he hated the word as much as I did. "Your husband's original will left you a life estate and place the remainder in trust for Ethan. I drafted it. I was there when he signed it. That document is consistent with the man I knew." He took off his glasses and cleaned them with the corner of his tie, a tell he had never been able to shake. "The second will arrived by courier 7 months after Daniel's death. It was accompanied by a remote notarization link and a certification from an out-of-state notary. It purported to supersede the first will and convey everything to a family LLC. Arrived from where? Noah asked. A Skid Row corporate suite in Delaware with 500 entities and 2 people, Alan said. I called the number on the letterhead. No one picked up. I emailed the contact address. I received an automated reply from a paralegal named... He checked a note. Maria. There were no grammatical errors. It was his way of saying the note was written by someone who knew exactly which details persuade. It wasn't Daniel's signature, I said. He wrote like a carpenter, block letters for printing, and a slow, dignified script when he signed his name. He did his loops like an insurance agent from the 1950s. Alan's eyes flicked to mine. He nodded, slowly. The signature looked right. That is, it looked like a copy of his hand. It also looked like it had been written by a confident machine. He placed his hands flat on the table to keep them from fidgeting. I asked for the original. The courier later delivered a glossy, stiff, slightly oversized sheet of paper that made me think of cheap certificates handed out in gymnasiums. If you ran your hands over the surface, you could not feel ink. The stamp had the tactile quality of a sticker. Deepfake documents, Noah said. More than print manipulation, Brooks added. If they submitted a notarization video, they did, Alan said, a short clip. Daniel seated at a desk in a room I didn't recognize. He looked thinner, paler, but his voice sounded right. The words coming from his mouth sounded right. But, I asked, because there is always a but when lawyers rehearse tragedies. Alan swallowed. His mouth and voice moved in perfect time, he said, but something about his eyes didn't. The blinks were slightly too even. The left eye had a tiny lag you wouldn't notice unless you knew him well or unless you watched him try to hide a headache. I put my elbows on the table and pressed my hands to my forehead. The room seemed to tilt. I saw Daniel in his workroom with sawdust on his forearms. I heard him say, "Don't let anyone tell you there isn't such a thing as grain in paper." He taught me to feel for it, to notice the direction fiber wanted to tear. He taught me what was real. "Alan," Brooks said evenly, "you've seen thousands of signatures. Why didn't you stop this?" His face pulled tight. "Because the formalities looked satisfied," he said. "Because my ethical role was to present a document to the court that purported to be what it claimed to be and let the judge decide." He spread his hands again in a helpless gesture that made him look briefly like the boy who used to drop his pencil down the back of third-grade seats. And because Claire strolled in here with an ounce of contempt and a pound of case law and made me feel like a dinosaur. "Claire," I said. "She insisted the will be admitted," Alan said. "She filed a motion to convert the estate and transfer property rapidly to minimize tax consequences. She was prepared." Noah's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced down and slid it to me. The email subject line was a little drum roll. Guardianship file, exhibits. He opened it and we scrolled together. Exhibit A, a physician's affidavit. Exhibit B, a neuropsychological screen. Exhibit C, a sworn statement from a neighbor who had observed confusion and wandering. "I don't wander," I said. "It's all recent," Noah said. "Dates from the last 2 weeks." "Doctor?" Brooks asked. "Signed by Paul Larkin, Maryland," Noah said. "Affiliated with Mid-Coast Wellness Providers, an LLC with a P.O. box." "Claire's cousin," I said automatically, and then clamped my mouth. I had heard the name once at a 4th of July barbecue where people drank more than the sun warranted. Brooks looked at me. "You're sure?" "I'm sure she has a cousin named Paul," I said. "I'm less sure he's a doctor." "We'll check his license," Brooks said, standing. "Noah, send me PDFs. Alan, don't destroy anything. Consider this conversation the prelude to a warrant if one becomes necessary." "Margaret," she said, and her voice softened. "Do you have copies of your original will? The one I can look at without needing a court order to break into Claire's security cabinet?" I nodded. "In the house in the cabinet in my husband's study," I said, and then laughed a cracked laugh at my own sentence. "Where I don't live anymore." Noah tapped the table softly. "We'll get you in," he said, "one way or another." We did not break in. That would have satisfied something primal in me. the part that likes clean breaks and righteous acts, but it would have undercut what I wanted more than revenge, to be believed. Brooks went to a judge with a file under her arm, a stack of exhibits in a binder that made a soft thump on the clerk's desk. She emerged 2 hours later with a narrow piece of paper that said, "Search," in the space where the form said warrant and my name in longhand, the way some judges still write when they want to remember they are signing for a person and not just a case. We drove back to the house on Old Quarry Road in Brooks's unmarked Ford. The winter sun angled off the bay and made the water look like hammered metal. Claire's SUV was gone. Ethan's car was not. I thought for a moment of the day we bought him a used Subaru with a dent in the door and a so clean title I like to say it sang. Now he drove something that cost more than my first salary. Brooks paused in the driveway and read me in her rearview mirror. "You okay?" she asked. "No," I said, because lying to her would have accomplished nothing. "But we can do it anyway." We walked up the crushed shells, the smallest sounds loud because of the way my body measured effort. When Brooks knocked, Ethan opened the door. The expression that crossed his face was a storm front. Surprise, then calculation, then the stubbornness I remembered from third-grade homework temper tantrums that resulted in a crumpled math sheet and an apology an hour later. "Detective," he said, "Mom." "We have a warrant," Brooks said neutrally, "to access your father's study and remove documents belonging to Margaret Holloway." "It's not your house," Ethan said, turning to me. His voice got very quiet on the last 2 words, as if softness would make it moral. "Let her in," Brooks said, and when Ethan hesitated, she reached into her coat and held up the paper close enough for his eyes to read. "You are free to stand aside. You are not free to obstruct." He did the thing with his shoulder again, small, defensive, a door in human form, and then he stepped back and let me pass. The entryway rug was new, something geometric and expensive, and at odds with the blue and white runner that had warmed this floor since before I learned how to fix the fringe. A table where we used to throw keys had been replaced with a sculptural bowl that looked like a metallic sea creature. I passed into the living room and felt the weight of a missing map more than anything present. The study door was closed. Brooks tried the knob, unlocked. She stood aside. I opened it. Daniel's workbench always smelled slightly of varnish and cedar. That day, it smelled like nothing. Claire had rearranged the furniture. The desk had been turned away from the window, as if the room needed to face something other than daylight. The old oak file cabinet stood against the far wall. The top drawer still had a dent where Daniel once knocked a clamp against it and swore. Brooks began to photograph things the way cops photograph, from the door, from the middle of the room, in a grid that would let a stranger later reconstruct the life of the space. Noah stood back, not wanting to contaminate the room, and took notes with his head ducked like a boy who learned to be brave without announcing it. I went to the cabinet. The drawer slid open with a small groan that sounded like disapproval. Blue Pendaflex folders sat in rows the way I had left them. I pulled one halfway, and the tab I had labeled with my neat slanted hand said, Estate. Inside, an envelope lay tidy and square. I picked it up. The paper had the frayed edge of something torn carefully. It had been opened not by slitting the flap, but by steaming it over a kettle. Daniel had taught me how to tell. We did it as a joke, to read a teenager's college acceptance letter he'd asked us to keep sealed until after dinner. That night, we confessed. It became a family story. Now the memory cut at angles. I slipped the original will into my bag. "Anything else?" Brooks asked. I stared at the shelves where Daniel kept things that did not like light. "The safe," I said. In its place on the floor sat an imprinted square in the carpet, the indented absence of a weight that had sat there for 20 years. "Where?" Brooks asked. "Gone," I said. We searched the room slowly. There was nothing that wasn't expected and everything out of place. I looked at the window. I used to stand there and watch my husband come in from the shed. That day, what I saw outside instead was the way the winter light became an alibi for nothing. Noah cleared his throat softly, a sound that still meant, I think I found something. "Margaret," he said, pointing to the back of the bottom shelf, "do you see that?" I crouched, my knees clicking. On the shelf's backer board, Daniel had scratched lightly with an awl, the kind of line that becomes a map for someone who knows how to read it. A small mark near the base molding looked like a carpenter's fooling line, a signal that two pieces once fit, and a reminder of how to put them back. I slid my fingers along the molding until I found a barely perceptible notch. I pressed. A thin panel popped inward and then out like a tongue. Behind it, a narrow cavity, dusty and intact. Inside, a little roll of paper tied with fishing line. My hands shook as I slid it out. The fishing line felt like the patient kind, the one Daniel used when he wanted to teach a boy how to untie a knot without cutting it. I unrolled the paper. It was school letterhead, not the current design, the kind we used before we rebranded to look like we were better than we were. On the top, in Daniel's slow, careful hand, the words, "Codicil to the last will and testament of Daniel James Holloway." I did not breathe. I read. The codicil reaffirmed the original will. It revoked any later document not signed in the presence of two witnesses and our friend, Pastor Lee, who Daniel trusted more than any notary. It explicitly granted me a life estate and gave me discretion to sell and downsize if the house ever became too much. At the bottom, Daniel had signed his name in the same loops he made on checks to grandchildren. Two signatures of witnesses followed, Alan Pierce and Pastor Lee. The date was 10 days before Daniel died. Alan, I called over my shoulder. He came in so fast his shoulder glanced off the door jamb. He read. He pressed his lips together like a man who had been given a reprieve and then realized it only bought him time. "I witnessed this," he said. His voice broke. "I remember this night. He came by after supper. We signed at the church." I looked at Ethan, who stood in the doorway with his arms folded, as if that could keep him from falling apart. His face told me the same story his mouth had told at 9 when he cried because honesty had felt bigger than he was. He had known, somewhere, that this would come. "Call your cyber guy," Brooks said to Noah, not looking away from the codicil. "And call the probate clerk. We need a hearing fast." Noah stepped into the hall and made a call that would, later, bring a man named Ravi Patel to our town with a laptop full of ways to force a fake to confess. He called the clerk and requested an emergency motion to suspend the guardianship and rehear the will. He called his editor and said he wanted a full blackout until after the hearing because he loved his former principal more than he loved a scoop. Then he turned his phone off and stood in my kitchen looking at my sink as if it had a story he wanted to read without words. By afternoon, we had a hearing scheduled for 2 days later. In the hours between, I signed papers. We filed motions and made copies and watched Brooks begin a process that turned into a slow, insistent siege of Claire's professional life. The judge issued a temporary injunction freezing transfers from the Holloway Family LLC. He issued an order for Claire to produce the original notarization video for the second will and to bring to court the notary who witnessed it. That night, I slept in my own house on the couch with a blanket over my knees because the bed upstairs smelled too much like the life I wanted to reclaim in one lungful. The refrigerator hummed with a steady intimacy. At 2 a.m, I woke to the creak of the heating system and the sound of my own name, as if my husband had said it in the next room. I stood in the dark and let the syllable rest on my tongue. Mar Garrett. The doctor at rehab had told me to practice all the sounds, plosives, liquids, nasal stops, so I whispered all of them then, like prayers. The courthouse in Rockland looks like it can withstand any weather. Inside, the floors shine from 100 years of wax. The courtroom had pews that made me think of kindergarten and funerals. Judge Miriam O'Keefe took her seat with a posture that said she had no interest in anyone's theatrics. Claire stood at the counsel table in a navy suit that would have intimidated someone who liked to be intimidated. She didn't look at me. Alan sat beside me as my lawyer because the line between neighbor and counsel had been erased for me and made harder for him. On my other side, Noah sat quiet and still and carried in his pocket a recording device he did not intend to use. Brooks stood near the back with arms folded. A man in a dark suit I did not recognize sat 2 rows behind Claire's table, reading silently and practicing a face that made him invisible. Later, I would learn his name was Special Agent Ravi Patel. The hearing began with procedure. It moved, as courts do when the wheels are properly greased, with steadiness that feels almost kind. Claire rose to defend the second will. She spoke with precision. She referred to case law from the last 20 years that pried open the door for remote notarization. She handed the clerk a USB drive as if she were placing a communion wafer on a tongue. When the video began, the courtroom fell into that peculiar silence that the modern world brings to old rooms. The hush of electronics, the held breath of people about to watch something that will tell them whether they have been fools. He was there, Daniel, or a pattern that wanted to be him. He sat at a desk I did not recognize. A lamp illuminated the left side of his face. He spoke in his patient voice. He said his name and that he was in his sound mind. He said he was revoking all prior wills. He looked at a camera. He smiled, and it broke me a little because my husband smiled with his whole face, and the man on the screen smiled like an actor in a commercial who'd been told to convey trust. "Stop," I said, maybe too loud. The judge looked at me. "I'm sorry," I said, "but could we watch again?" The judge nodded. We watched it twice more. The third time, Ravi rose and moved closer to the screen, not touching, but so near his glasses reflected the light from the frame. "Your Honor," he said when the video stopped, "with the court's permission, I'd like to draw attention to 3 anomalies." He walked the judge through a primer. Not too condescending, not too technical. The way a good teacher explains the moon. He pointed to the blink rate. 80 blinks per minute, he said softly. Human average is about 15 to 20. High blink rates can indicate deception in human faces. In fakes, it often results from older models and lazy stitching. He slowed the video and highlighted head motion that didn't match mic wobble. He pointed out how the light across the cheek stayed constant even as the shadow from the lamp should have changed with small movements. He requested permission to play the audio separate and overlaid with an analysis filter that produced a spectral graph that pulsed with color like a weather radar. "Do you see this?" he said, pointing to repeating bands. "Voice cloning, high quality, the model overfit. You can't tell with the ear alone, but it's there." Claire objected on the ground that this was not cross-examination, but a tech demo. The judge allowed it with a hand wave that told her she would win some and lose this one. "Your Honor," Alan said when it was his turn, "we also have an original codicil signed 10 days before Daniel died, executed per Maine law, witnessed by me and Reverend Andrew Lee." He passed the paper up. The judge read it, and something in her face softened in that private way courtroom faces do when they're reading something that acknowledges a human. Claire stood and argued that a later document supersedes a prior codicil. The judge looked at her the way a principal looks at an honor student trying to rush a flimsy excuse and said, "If it's a will," "And it is," Claire said. "And I will decide," the judge said. Her tone made the bailiff cough to cover a smile. The notary who appeared on the video was not in the courtroom. We waited 10 minutes while Claire whispered into her phone, shoulders tight, and then announced the notary was in transit. The judge passed 30 minutes by hearing a traffic appeal and a landlord-tenant argument in which the landlord's voice got shaky when he realized he was wrong. Then the notary arrived. She looked 30 and tired in the way people do when they think they have made a small compromise for a big fee. She swore she had performed the remote notarization properly. She clicked through her downloaded rules like flashcards. Ravi asked to see her notary log. She handed over a printed sheet with clean lines and no smears. He looked at it the way a person looks at a painting everyone loves and no one understands. "What's this?" he asked her, pointing to a 10-digit code that repeated in every entry like a heartbeat. "My notary platform session ID," she said. "Every session the same?" he asked, tone mild. "Sometimes," she said. "Or every time?" he asked. She swallowed. Her lower lip got shiny. "Every time," she said. Ravi looked at the judge. "Your Honor, that's impossible." He held up a single page of something printed on dark paper. "This is a hash collision map. It shows every session was assigned the same unique code. Unique codes are not unique when they are identical. This system is a shell. I've seen it before, in cases where the platform is a prop and the processes happened offline." He passed the paper to the clerk. "In short, she didn't notarize this video. She stamped it." Claire began to pivot to call the platform vendor to suggest anomalies could occur in legitimate systems, to say the word practical as if it held the moral and legal weight of right. But the floor had shifted. The judge's face did that thing stern faces do when they realize they are being asked to hold up a lie heavy enough to make their hands shake. "Miss Holloway," the judge said, looking at me, "where did you find the codicil?" "In a hidden panel," I said, and felt foolish the moment the words left my mouth. The judge did not smile. "My grandmother had one," she said, "in the back of her pantry behind the flour. What else did you find?" "Nothing," I said, "but the safe is gone. It sat on the carpet so long it left a mark." She nodded. "I'm going to suspend recognition of the second will pending a full hearing and credible expert testimony. I'm reinstating the original will and codicil for now." She turned to Claire. "And I'm lifting the temporary guardianship, effective immediately." She held Claire's gaze. "Your ex parte was sloppy, counsel. I will assume for the moment that sloppiness was born of haste rather than contempt." Claire's jaw flexed in a small way that told me she had learned not to move when she wanted to. We walked out into the hallway that smelled like old wood and floor cleaner. The air felt less viscous than when we walked in. I leaned my hand against the cool wall and put my forehead beside it for a second. Noah stood like a guard dog near my shoulder. Brooks was already on her phone, her voice low and controlled, getting a warrant for Claire's files because sloppiness born of haste is often where crimes sit and tap their fingers. Alan called Pastor Lee to tell him the thing he witnessed that night in the church office might still matter after all. Ethan approached. He had not testified. He had not said a single word in the room. Now his voice came out as if he'd run 5 miles and didn't remember why he had begun. "Mom," he said, "I didn't know she—" I looked at my son and saw 1,000 moments at once. Him on a swing with his hair in his eyes, him scowling over algebra, him holding his child for the first time while he cried because he was afraid of breaking something small. "Stop," I said softly. "If you didn't know, you can help us find out. If you did, you can tell the truth and let it change you." He opened his mouth, closed it. I watched a war run across his face and then saw, briefly, the boy who had once returned a $20 bill because the idea of being someone who kept it felt like too much to carry. He swallowed. "I can show you her files," he said. "I have her laptop when she travels. She has me log in as her if she's in court. I know her password." Noah's eyes met mine. Brooks lowered her phone a fraction. "Do you want to help your mother, Mr. Holloway?" Brooks asked. Her voice had no leftover of friendliness in it. It had only the thing that keeps trains on tracks. Because this is where that becomes real. We followed Ethan to the car as if walking across West Street could be the most dangerous thing we did all day. He drove us to Claire's firm, a glass-fronted little fortress she rented space in beside a yacht broker. He let us in with a key card. The receptionist's smile died when she saw Brooks behind us. The smile's ghost died when she saw the warrant. Claire's office smelled like expensive coffee and unstated ambition. Her laptop sat open on the desk like an obedient pet waiting to be told what to fetch. Ethan typed in a password. He had to wipe his palms on his pants before he hit enter. The screen bloomed with a wallpaper of a city, not our town. Files nested in files. Brooks took a picture of the screen. Ravi unrolled a small kit and removed a paper-thin device he slid between the hinge and the screen. He powered up a handheld that would have made my computer teacher in 1985 faint. "We need a mirror image," he said. "We want the ghost as much as the body." He began a process that made the laptop look, to an untrained eye, asleep. In truth, it was confessing. Ethan pointed with a slightly shaking finger at a folder named Estate. Inside, subfolders labeled with names that made me wince. Holloway_codicil, Holloway LLC, Notary_platform. He opened Holloway_codicil, PDFs and JPGs, Zoom calls clipped and spliced with dates that did not correspond to the night Daniel sat in our kitchen and signed paper with a pen that made a sound like rain on a tent. "What's this?" Noah asked. pointing at a file named Lee_witness_alt. Ethan clicked. A document opened that made my mouth taste like pennies. It was a letter on church letterhead in which Reverend Lee appeared to attest that he had not witnessed Daniel's codicil and that he found the document suspect. The signature looked like his. The choice of words did too, if you didn't know that the Reverend's wife always corrected the way he spelled publicly and would never have let a stray comma live that way. At the bottom, a file history showed dates and edits and a saving to a folder named Press, as if Clara drafted a way to leak doubt if doubt became necessary. Ravi clicked open notary_platform. He scrolled silently for 1 minute, 2. He exhaled through his nose, slow. "Here it is," he said. He copied a small log file to his device with a sound no one else heard. "The session ID generator script is a loop," he said. "It emits the same random number over and over. It's designed to look like a system. It's a stage set." "Claire built a platform," Noah said, awe and disgust tangled in his voice. "She hired a kid," Ethan said, his own disgust aimed at himself. "Eleanor's cousin. He coded monkeys in Boston for cash. He made the front end. She wrote the scripts. I tested it." He pushed his palms into his eyes for a long second that made me want to stop everything and pull him away from the desk and sit on the floor like when he was 10, after we made him apologize to the librarian for snapping a pencil in half when she spoke too softly. "I didn't think it would be used for—" He gestured around at the room, at the idea of the whole world of harm that could happen in an office with a door and a lock. "Of course you didn't," I said, and he flinched. He looked at me with a boy's hope for a reprieve and a man's knowledge that words don't perform miracles when the facts are awake and standing. "We found more than we expected in 2 hours of patient looking. We found emails to a Delaware agent with a signature that looked like block letters typed by a person who liked letting software decide what a signature ought to be. We found a PDF of a neuro-psych test with my name and numbers beside it, and a score that made me look like a person who didn't know her own address. I said my address out loud right then, without thinking, like a person refusing an erasure. 63 Old Quarry Road, Rockport, Maine. Brooks leaned against the wall and tipped her head and wrote, without looking up, the same thing. We found a folder named Larkin, Medical Letterhead Templates. A signature image of a doctor's name dragged from one document to another like a sticker, peeled and reapplied. When Brooks called the state medical board, the woman at the other end of the line said in a tired, precise voice, "We have a licensed Dr. Larkin. He practices in Bangor. He does not sign forms for cousins of out-of-state attorneys." We found the video files used to make Daniel's face say words he never said. We found a directory labeled Harvest that contained audio scraped from years of videos. My husband telling a story at a retirement dinner. My husband reading A Child's Christmas in Wales for the grandkids on a December Saturday. My husband swearing softly when he dropped a hammer on his thumb, and then laughing at his own word choice and apologizing to the empty air. We listened to enough for Ravi to say, "It's enough." By afternoon, the FBI had entered the chat, as Noah would say. The office grew full and then less full as technicians took the laptop away and made copies and then left it looking exactly as it had and placed it back in its slot like a thing visited by a god. Ethan sat with his hands between his knees and looked at the baseboard and counted something I couldn't see. Claire did not come to the office while we were there. She texted once to Ethan. How did it go? His thumbs hovered. He typed, "Fine." He deleted it. He typed, "We need to talk." He deleted that too. He put the phone face down, the international gesture for, "I cannot do this like this." When the building exhaled the last of the agents and the air felt our own again, Noah and I walked to the harbor to look at boats and the way they implied motion even when tied tight. He put his hands in his coat and squinted at the water as if between the ripples there might be instructions. "The yearbook," he said out of nowhere. "What?" I asked with just enough crankiness to make us both smile. "You used to write quotes in our yearbooks," he said. "You had one you loved that made the football boys roll their eyes. The faintest ink is better than the strongest memory." "Chinese proverb," I said, "questionably attributed. A good thing for boys who think people will always be around to remember for them." "You gave me a yearbook the year I took the editor job," he said. You wrote that in the front and make it matter under it. I put it in a box with clippings when I left town. When you texted me from that motel last night, I dug out the box after you went to sleep. I brought the yearbook with me today because I wanted to show you you mattered to me. I didn't know you kept, I said and stopped. I didn't want to cry near Fish. He pulled the book from his bag. The cover was frayed at the corners. The Celadon High School crest looked almost embarrassed to be so earnest. He handed it to me. I opened it. There, on the first page, my handwriting, slanted and neat. I touched the ink with the tip of my index finger. It had seeped into the paper in a way that feels like ownership. I flipped through the pages and felt both too old and newly 10. I opened the back cover and felt something catch. "Do you feel that?" I asked. He frowned. "What?" "The end paper," I said. I flattened and then lifted the back cover. The paper was thicker near the spine in a way that did not belong to paper. I slid my fingernail along the edge. It offered. I peeled. A second sheet glued beneath. Beneath it, a pocket. In the pocket, something wrapped in wax paper the way my grandmother wrapped sandwiches. I unwrapped it. A slim folded sheet of self-carbon copy paper, the kind Daniel used to keep in his tool chest for making notes twice, fell into my hand. On the top, in Daniel's script, the words, "If you forget where I put this, look where memory lives." "What is it?" Noah asked, leaning in. "It's ridiculous," I said, and my lip trembled. "And perfect. And him." The sheet was a letter addressed to me and to the person who might need to negotiate with me if anyone ever tried to say my husband had meant something else with his last words. It said, "I wrote a codicil. If another will appears, know that it is false. Know that I wanted you in that house until you wanted to leave or the roof said otherwise. Know that I always knew the difference between money and a life." I laughed, a sound that startled a gull. "This is not legally necessary," I said, and the rest of the sentence got lost in my throat. "It is practically beautiful," Noah said. We took the letter to Alan. He read it and put his face in his hands for a second that made me wish we'd all been younger together. He filed it with the court. He filed a motion to sanction Claire for abuse of process. Brooks filed paperwork with the county prosecutor. Ravi began a process that made hard drives sing at frequencies only the guilty can hear. In the days that followed, news moved like weather. Claire hired a lawyer with a smile that looked like a cut. Ethan moved out of the house he had been so quick to control and into a rental with a futon and an air that reminded me of his first apartment when he thought a plant was a luxury. He called me on a Tuesday night at 9 and said, "I want to talk to the FBI." I said, "Talk to your lawyer first." He said, "I did." He testified for 3 hours. He told them the password to a cloud drive named documents_archive that contained every foolish thing Claire believed a folder name could hide. He cried once. No one said anything when he did. I met with a woman from Adult Protective Services whose desk plant had a second chance at life and whose eyes told me she'd seen worse people than my son and more decent people than my heart could bear. She gave me a pamphlet titled Financial Exploitation by Family Members and apologized for the way the title made a day feel like a year. The second hearing felt less like a cliff and more like a slope I could climb without looking down. The judge sanctioned Claire's firm for abuse of the court. She referred evidence of fraud to the district attorney and to federal prosecutors. She reinstated my life estate as if it had never been disturbed because, in fact, it had never been. She shook Alan's hand, something I had never seen a judge do, and said, "Thank you for owning your part and fixing it." We did not arrest Claire in a dramatic hallway scene. We did not clap when an agent said, "Ma'am, please come with us." We found her at her office at 10 in the morning. She wore a gray suit and the exact wrong expression for someone about to lose. When Brooks read her rights, she made a small noise in her throat that sounded like something feral that had learned to speak human vowels. She asked for a lawyer. She got one. She pled not guilty on day 1 and then began to receive copies of things that suggested the word plea in a different voice. She recognized the stack of her own writing. I recognized nothing of her. Ethan took a plea. He stood in a courtroom he had never expected to stand in and said the words, "I'm guilty," in a voice that made me want to remember the day he graduated from college and not this day. He was sentenced to 3 years in a minimum security facility. The judge told him he had a chance to be better than the worst thing he had done. He looked at me when he said thank you, because he needed a face to anchor to. I went to see him once, right after he began his sentence. The visitation room had fluorescent lights and a clock that ran 5 minutes slow. He looked too young in an institutional shirt. He looked exactly like the man who had stood in my doorway and blocked my way. The two images made a collage in my head that was less art than wound. "Mom," he said. "Ethan," I said. "I know you don't have to be here," he said. "I know," I said. He swallowed. "I didn't know about the video." "I know," I said again. I had come to understand precisely which things my son was capable of and which he was not. He was capable of weakness and of ambition blinding him and of trusting the wrong person because the wrong person told him he could be right. He was not capable, I was increasingly certain, of planning to erase a man's voice and call it justice. "I wrote to Dad," he said, and then laughed once, a hard sound. I wrote like he could read. I wrote to have a place to put the words. "What did you write?" I asked. "I wrote that I didn't become the man he wanted," he said, "and that I might someday if I keep moving in the direction of the part that's still decent." "Good," I said. "Keep doing that every day you wake up." He nodded. He lifted his eyes and then dropped them. "Do you think you'll forgive me?" he asked. I thought about honesty as a child. I thought about a boy who returned $20. I thought about a man who helped build a fake stage set and then refused to perform on it. "Forgiveness isn't a door," I said. "It's a road. I'm on it. I don't know how far it goes." He nodded. He made a small sound that I recognized as the way he used to swear and then apologize. "All right," he said. "Do," I said. "I'll read." I walked out into a parking lot where the wind took my hair and made me look like a woman in a movie who had learned something. Noah waited in the car with the heater on. He did not ask me how it went. He handed me a cup of tea from a thermos, as if water and leaves could keep the world from breaking. "Do you remember when you made me stand in front of the school and say I'm sorry?" he asked after a few quiet minutes. "For what?" I said, and smiled without meaning to. "There were so many." "For the time I printed a rumor about a teacher," he said, "and you said that the strength of the proof must match the strength of the harm, that you never publish what you can't carry." I said that. "You did," he said, "and I never forgot it." "Good," I said, "because it's true." Spring arrived like a cautious person opening a door. The bay held on to its cold longer than the maples did. The roses behind the kitchen re-sprouted exactly where I'd cut them back, as if they had written their own codicil. I moved the desk in the study back toward the window. The minute I did, the room exhaled. I found the safe at a storage unit Claire had rented under a false company that sounded like a perfume. When the agents cut the lock, the sound made my teeth hurt. Inside, my jewelry sat in a mess as if it had passed through someone else's hands. I let myself feel that a little. Then I closed the lid and waited until a woman with a clipboard wrote down each piece. We took it home. I placed Daniel's wedding ring in a small dish on the dresser where it had lived for 30 years. It looked like it had found its way back by itself. The FBI did what the FBI does when there are computers to be read. Ravi sent me occasional updates in a voice that made me think of a good math teacher explaining a proof. "We found a client list," he said in one such update. "Other estates, other guardianships, not all in Maine." It turned out Claire had a side business. I had never liked the phrase side hustle. It disguised 1,000 moral hazards in the word hustle. She had a blueprint for moving assets through a system that loved paperwork more than people. She had 3 other clients, 2 elderly women, 1 widower, whose children had been coached into believing that expedience was compassion. She had, as far as we could tell, 2 notaries who used stamps like spoons, and 1 doctor in another county who wanted cash more than he wanted his license. The world is full of small bargains that add up to a crime. We testified again, this time in federal court. The judge's robe swished when she walked. It made me think of choir. Claire pled to charges with too many numbers: wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy. She looked smaller and somehow more dangerous when she was quiet. She wore makeup that made her face look like a mask. She looked at me once as if memorizing me for a story she would tell in a room where mirrors felt like friends. I looked back like a person who had something stronger than rage, a life. I thought often of Pastor Lee's signature and of the way a comma can make a sentence mean something else. I thought of how close we came to the version where no one looks, where a good fake and an average judge get a document through, and a woman goes to a place where the staff mispronounces her name. I thought of the woman from APS and her plant. One night, as May got close to summer, I sat at the kitchen table with a pad of paper and wrote the name of a thing I wanted to build: the Holloway Fund for Senior Justice. It felt grandiose and necessary. I wrote a mission: advise, protect, educate. I made a list of the things I could give without having to be in 3 places at once. My ability to read a document like I was taught by a patient man who knew the grain in paper. My ability to sit with a person and hear the fear beneath the words. My ability to call a former student and ask him to show up. I called Alan and asked if he would serve on the board. He said yes in a voice that sounded like maybe he had been waiting to be asked to do something he could call good. I called Brooks and asked if she would be an advisor. She said yes, and then started to say, I probably shouldn't, and then said, I'll ask the chief, and then texted the next morning with a 3-sentence answer that made me trust her in ways that had nothing to do with arrest warrants. Noah came over on a Saturday with his sleeves rolled and a list of donors. I wrote about you without naming you, he said, sliding a newspaper across the table. The headline said, The Will That Wasn't. I read the story. It was gentle and sharp at once, like a good knife. He didn't have to tell the world who we were for the world to know. People called and emailed and sent checks with notes like, my mother almost lost her house once. People are hungry for decency. They don't know where to buy it, so they send money to the closest thing. I stood on my porch that first truly warm evening and watched a neighbor walk past with a dog that looked like it had a PhD. Eleanor from across the street. Eleanor Price, new since autumn, retired professor with a sense of humor that flickered like candlelight, waved. Concert next Friday, she called. You coming? I am, I said. I meant more than the concert. We did not become who we were before the paper stunt Claire tried to pull on a life. We did not move back into innocence, but I moved back into my house. I sat at the window and read a novel that had nothing to do with law and ate an apple and felt like a person whose body belonged to her. I walked to the harbor and watched a kid learn to tie a bowline and fought the urge to walk over and correct his loop because I am a mother, and we meddle. At the end of June, Ethan wrote me a letter. He wrote every week. He often wrote what he ate and who he talked to because the small things, he said, made him feel like he was participating in the life he had given away. This letter was different, it said. They have a restorative justice circle on Thursdays. I went. I listened to a man talk about the thing he did when he thought he had no choice and the people he hurt. I told him I threw my mother out of her home because I told myself it was practical. He cried, I didn't. It felt like progress. He wrote, I don't think you'll ever forgive me completely. I don't expect you to. I don't think Dad would have either. I think he would have stood in front of me and said, Son, you can keep walking. I read the letter on the porch swing. The house made its small noises. Pipes, the tick of the clock that had sat on the mantel since we were young. I thought of forgiveness as a road again, and I thought, some days I could walk farther than others. Claire's sentencing happened in September. The courtroom felt like fall, even though it was climate-controlled. The prosecutor read the list of people she had touched with her careful crimes. She stared at the space above his head like someone trying to fix the spot on the ceiling. She apologized. It sounded like a person who had read an apology in a book and memorized the cadence. The judge did not reward performance. She sentenced Claire to 18 years. The number made a sound in the room like something closing. Claire turned and looked for me, and I did not look back because I did not need to be in her story anymore. On the sidewalk afterward, Noah put his hand on my shoulder. Do you feel it? He asked. Relief, I said. Something like that, he said. I always love the way you look at the moment a thing ends and begins at the same time. It's just a corner, I said. We turned it. Yeah, he said, but the old street is behind us. We built the fund. We hosted a workshop in the town library on how to spot a predatory guardianship petition. We printed flyers that said in large letters, if a thing needs secrecy to survive, it probably shouldn't. Brooks taught a group of women how to lock down their credit profiles so no one could open a card in their name. Alan explained codicils in plain English. Ravi came up from Boston on a rainy Tuesday and frightened a room full of grandmothers in the best possible way by showing them how a voice can be faked if it has somewhere to draw from. He ended with, here's the trick, don't hand out your voice for free. And everyone laughed because the phrase sounded like a gentle scold from someone's mother. On a Sunday in October, I stood in the kitchen in the exact patch of light where I had once watched a toddler throw Cheerios and then learn to catch them. I looked at my hands and thought of all the documents they had touched in the last year. I thought of paper grain and digital fraud and the way your name is a thing you think you own until someone tries to say it for you. I pulled a cutting board from the counter. I sliced an apple into 8 wedges and salted the slices like I had taught my son in the year he was too tall for the grocery cart. I carried the plate to the back porch. I looked at the roses. The late blooms wilted. They did it beautifully. The phone rang. Eleanor from across the street. You ready? She asked. For what? I said, and then remembered. The chamber music concert in Camden? I smiled. I'm coming, I said. She paused. You good? She asked. I am, I said, and I'm not, and it's okay. Good, she said. We'll be in the car in 5. I hung up. I looked at the brass plaque beside the door. Holloway. The light made the letters warm. I touched the H with my fingers like a person taking attendance. I whispered my full name. Then I locked the door, put the key in my pocket, and walked into a night I didn't need to be afraid of. On the drive, Eleanor told me about a line from a poem she loved. Everything will be saved. Everything. We both laughed the quiet laugh of women who know better. But I wish it for you, she said. Me too, I said, and rested my head against the car window like a girl on the way to a dance. At the concert, a cello opened a piece with a sound like a man saying the name of a woman he loves. I closed my eyes and let the bow cut and soothe. When the pianist came in, I thought of paper and how it holds the marks we make on it without judgment. When the music stopped, I opened my eyes. Noah texted me a photo of a check. Anonymous. $50,000. Memo line. For names that belong to their owners. I smiled. I put my phone away. I pressed my palms together and felt the way my fingers still belonged to me. Winter came back like a season taught to pay attention. Ethan wrote what became a good letter every week. He asked about the roses, and about a neighbor's dog, and about the way the bay looks when the sky is pewter. He read books. He worked in the library. He drew a map of the road he wanted to walk when he could, one that passed by my house, because he said a road that didn't pass by that house did not and don't count. On the anniversary of the day I rolled my suitcase up the crushed shell drive and found my name had been erased, I stood in the front hall and looked at the spot where Ethan had blocked my way. The rug was different. The home was the same. I said out loud to the empty air, I kept my life. The air said nothing back, the way air does when it agrees. I sat at the desk in the study, in the position Daniel always placed it because the light was better when it faced the window. I picked up a pen. I wrote a letter to the version of me who checked into a motel in a body that felt borrowed. I wrote, You are not being dramatic. People you love are acting small. You will be tired. You will feel like a person caught in a net. You will become a person who carries a knife and knows where to cut. You will not bleed out when you do. I folded the letter and tucked it beneath the desk blotter. If I forget, I said to the room, someone remind me. The house made a small sound like agreement. In the spring, I planted new roses. I chose varieties with names that made me laugh. Resilience, True Friend, Summer's Lawyer. I snipped them when they bloomed and put them in vases in rooms that needed proof of life. I placed one stem on the mantel beside a photograph of a man who knew the grain in paper and in people. No one ever returned the time the fake will try to steal. Time works the way weather does in Maine. You get what you get and you stand in it. But we made something with the time that followed that felt like a signature no one else could forge. We built a fund. We stopped 2 guardianship petitions before they started. We kept a woman in her house in Thomaston when her nephew arrived with a folder and a smile. We taught a class at the senior center titled How to Say No Without Explaining. 20 women sat in a circle and practiced saying it out loud and then laughed at what their mouths could do. On the day Ethan came home, I stood on my porch and watched for a car I recognized. When it pulled up and he stepped out, he looked like himself and not like a man released, which felt like a miracle small enough to be plausible. He walked to the bottom of the steps and stopped. He didn't come any closer. He said, "Hi, Mom." He said, "I'll go wherever you say." I said, "Come in." I said, "Leave your shoes by the door." I said, "I made a pot roast," and he laughed, because I always make a pot roast when I don't know what else to do, and because the humor that lives in a family is how we survived having one. We sat at the table where so many documents had been signed and discovered and debated, and we ate. We talked about small things because we needed to practice before we could lift the heavy thing between us. After dinner, he stood in the living room and looked at the map back on the wall. He traced the lines of Penobscot Bay with his finger the way he used to as a child, naming islands like a litany. North Haven, Venal Haven, Ealoho. He said, "Dad would hate how this feels. He would hate the part where I put away my wedding ring to clean and forgot where I put it," I said. And Ethan smiled, that helpless little smile that does as much as a prayer. We did not fix everything that night. We did not cure the part of me that flinched when someone else held my mail, but we began to live again in the same small rooms without making the walls feel like they were deciding for us. Sometimes, late in the evening, I sit by the window with the codicil on the desk and the letter Daniel tucked into a yearbook beside it. I touch the ink with my finger, lightly. I think of a proverb I used to write in kids' books because I wanted them to remember things the way paper does. The faintest ink is better than the strongest memory. I say out loud, I remember anyway. I know what happens to people like me when someone decides our names are convenient and our houses are assets and our signatures are soft. I know how quickly the word practical becomes the cover story for cruelty. I know now what it costs to say out, and I know what it takes to say no. This is not yours. When I walk in town now, people sometimes stop me and say, "Are you the one who—" and then stop because they're not sure how to say it. I say, "I'm Margaret," and offer my hand and watch the way a name works when you carry it with both palms up. I am not the person I was before any of this. I do not want to be. The person I am now knows how to read papers and people with equal attention. She knows when to call a former student, and when to call a detective, and when to call a judge by the proper honorific, and then look her in the eye and say, "This matters." The house knows me again. It creaks at the right times. It holds heat in the right corners. It smells like lemon oil on the days I ask it to. The brass plaque by the door shines when the sun hits it in the afternoon. It is not proof. It is not ownership. It is a reminder. When I run my fingers over the letters, I think of Daniel's loops and the way Ethan learned to write his name with a fat pencil, and the way I signed my first mortgage, like a person shaking hands with a thing she didn't fully understand but intended to keep sacred. When I lock the door at night, I check it twice, not because I'm afraid, but because I can. Then I turn out the light, go to bed, and sleep, as if the house and I have decided to keep each other. A month later, at the senior center, I taught a class with a title that made the room laugh when I wrote it on the whiteboard. What to do. When someone tries to steal your life with paper. 25 people came. They brought stories that made my chest tight. A nephew with a notarized letter, a banker who asked them to sign what he called a convenience, a daughter who wanted the house keys for safekeeping and then changed the locks. We sat in a circle. We practiced asking questions a person should always ask. Who benefits? Who witnesses? What happens if I say no? We called the class a success because the room felt like a choir by the end, voices strong and many. At the end, a tiny woman with the fierce eyes of a hawk approached me and pressed my hands in both of hers. "I like your name," she said. "It looks good on you." I laughed and said, "Thank you," and did not tell her how hard I had worked to keep it. And sometimes, when the harbor fog is so thick I can hardly see the spruce at the end of the yard, I stand at the window of my study, the desk turned just so, and I say Daniel's name. I say my own. I say Ethan's too. I say them like passwords I am unwilling to share with any platform that pretends to be human. On a day when the roses all bloomed at once, as if the bush had remembered something urgent, Noah stopped by with a stack of mail. He handed me an envelope from an attorney in Delaware that contained a check. A disgorgement. An ugly word for a decent event. He handed me a card from a woman in California who wrote, "After my husband died, his nephew took my house with papers. I moved into a trailer. I thought that was the end. Then I watched your story. My daughter and I found a lawyer. We are suing. Thank you for showing your face." I put the card on the mantel next to the rose. It looked right. "Do you know why this works?" Noah asked, standing at the window, looking at the water we always looked at as if it would tell us the plot. "Why, what works?" I asked. "This," he said, gesturing at the house and the study and the fund and the life. "Why the story lands, why people watch to the end. Because they think it could be them," I said simply, "and because they want to believe they could be me. Not me, but a person who doesn't go quiet." He nodded. "That's it," he said. "That's the sentence in my head when I sit down to write. Do not go quiet." "I won't," I said. "I can't." The day before Ethan's daughter turned 8, he came by with a cake box and a face that looked older and better. He stood in the kitchen and said, "Lucy wants you at the party." He said it like a request and a test. "I'll be there," I said. "I'll bring the good ice cream." He smiled, that relieved little, almost hidden smile boys get when someone finally says yes. He placed the cake on the counter and looked around the room like a person who has returned to a country after a war. He touched the edge of the table with his fingertips. "Thank you," he said. And I did not say, "For what?" as if the word could cover this. That night, after the house went quiet and the harbor lights made a little string of stars on the water, I took out the codicil again, not because I needed proof, because I liked the look of Danielle's hand. I touched the ink on his name. I whispered, "I did it," and waited, like always, for the floor to tell me whether I was lying. The floor said nothing and everything. It held me. It did not give way. It said, in the only language it has, "Stay."